All right, strap in, everybody. Today we are diving deep into some seriously dark territory with the case of Ricky Lee Green,
Ricky Lee Green,
a
yeah.
Texas serial killer who was executed in the late 90s. We've got excerpts from his Wikipedia page and a few news clippings. And honestly, this one is a real head-scratcher. I mean, what could possibly lead someone down a path like that?
Well, it's definitely a complicated case, but we're going to try to unpack it together piece by piece.
Yeah.
Our goal here isn't to just recount the gruesome details, but to try and understand, like, what factors might have contributed to Green, becoming a killer.
Right. It's not about glorifying the violence or anything like that. It's more about understanding, like, the psychology behind it all. The making of a monster, I guess you could say.
Making of a monster.
But of course, we can't forget the real impact on the victims and their families.
Absolutely.
This isn't just an abstract puzzle.
No, these were real people whose lives were tragically cut short.
Exactly. Okay, so let's start with the puzzle pieces themselves. Green's early life was, well, it was horrific. We're talking severe abuse from his father, electric shocks, beatings even, holding him underwater.
Wow.
I mean, how does a kid even survive that?
It's almost unimaginable. And the thing is, when a child experiences that kind of prolonged trauma, it can have a devastating impact on their development. Think about it. Those early years are crucial for forming healthy attachments, learning to regulate emotions, building a sense of self-worth. When those foundations are shattered by abuse, it can create a ripple effect that lasts a lifetime.
So are you saying that abuse like that can actually, like, wire someone's brain differently?
That's exactly what we're talking about.
Wow.
Studies have shown that childhood trauma can actually alter brain development, particularly in areas related to emotional processing and impulse control. It's like the brain gets stuck in a state of hypervigilance, always on high alert for danger.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Okay.
So Green is always looking out for danger, always feeling threatened,
Right.
even when there's no real threat.
Right. And that can lead to a distorted worldview, where violence might seem like the only way to protect oneself or exert control over a chaotic environment.
Right.
And we can't forget the barbed wire accident he had as a child, leaving him with a glass eye. I mean, talk about adding insult to injury.
Oh, man. Yeah. I hadn't even factored that in.
Yeah.
Kids can be so cruel, and something like that could absolutely make you feel like an outsider. Did Green ever talk about how that affected him?
He did mention feeling isolated and different from other kids. And we know that social isolation, combined with early trauma, can increase the risk of developing antisocial personality traits.
Right.
These are the kinds of traits we often see in individuals who engage in criminal behavior: a lack of empathy, disregard for social norms, difficulty forming meaningful relationships.
So it's not just one thing. It's this whole recipe for disaster, right? The abuse, the isolation, the physical, all of it coming together to create a perfect storm.
It's a complex interplay of factors. And then you add the murders to the equation, and it gets even more perplexing. Now, I know we don't want to dwell on the gruesome details, but to understand Green, we need to look for patterns in his crimes. Remember how the outline suggested grouping them thematically?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, just listing them off chronologically wouldn't really tell us much. So how did you group them?
Well, I noticed two distinct groups. Victims of opportunity, like people he picked up hitchhiking or encountered in vulnerable situations.
Okay.
And then there were victims he knew personally. That second group, the ones he had a connection with, is particularly intriguing.
Okay, now that is interesting. I mean, picking up a hitchhiker, that feels almost random, impulsive. But the ones he knew, that feels more deliberate, maybe even personal.
Exactly. And that's where we start to see a potential shift in motive. The victims of opportunity might have been driven by a need for power and control, a way to assert dominance in a world that had always felt chaotic and threatening. But the murders of people he knew, those could point to something deeper. Perhaps unresolved conflicts or feelings of resentment.
So maybe it wasn't just about control. Maybe it was about revenge, too. I mean, if we're talking about a distorted worldview and a lack of empathy, those could easily lead someone to justify violence as a way to right perceived wrongs.
You're picking up on some crucial nuances here. And then there's one more piece of this puzzle we need to consider. Sharon, Green's wife.
Oh, yeah, Sharon.
Her involvement in the murders is, well, let's just say it's complicated.
Oh, yeah, Sharon. I was just getting to her. I mean, her story is a whole other layer of messed up. On one hand, she claims she was forced into it, that Green coerced her. But on the other hand, she helped him dispose of at least one body. I mean, how do you even begin to unpack that?
It's a classic example of the complexities of spousal abuse and the dynamics of power and control within those relationships. We have conflicting accounts. Sharon claiming she was a victim, Green saying she was a willing participant.
Right.
And to make things even more complicated, she eventually received a remarkably light sentence, just 10 years of probation.
Wait, 10 years probation for being involved in multiple murders?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but that just doesn't seem right. I mean, how can that be considered justice?
Well, that's a great question, and it's one that the justice system grapples with all the time. Determining the truth in cases involving spousal abuse can be incredibly difficult. There are often no witnesses, and the victims themselves may be reluctant to come forward for fear of retaliation or further abuse.
So what, we're just supposed to take her word for it? I mean, I'm not saying she wasn't a victim in some ways, but she was also complicit in some horrific acts. How do we balance those things out?
It's a tough question, and there are no easy answers. But that's what makes this case so fascinating and so disturbing. It forces us to confront the gray areas of human behavior, the blurred lines between victim and perpetrator.
Okay, I think I need a moment to process all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Sharon's role, the different types of victims, it's all starting to make my head spin, but I have a feeling this is just the tip of the iceberg.
You're right about that. We still have Green's confession, his hunger strike, that strange detail about the bloodstained mattress. There's a lot more to unpack, and trust me, it gets even more intriguing from here.
Okay, my head is still spinning from that last part.
Oh.
The different types of victims, Sharon's involvement, it's like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces keep changing shape. But you mentioned Green's confession, the mattress. Maybe those pieces will help make things clearer.
Maybe, maybe not. Sometimes the more pieces you find, the more complicated the puzzle becomes. But you're right, the confession is a key piece in this whole saga. And it's a piece that has always puzzled me, to be honest. Why confess at all? Especially when the evidence against him wasn't exactly airtight at that point.
Yeah, that's what I don't get. I mean, wouldn't most people in his position just try to deny everything, hope to slip through the cracks of the justice system? What was Green's angle?
Well, some psychologists believe that confession, even for heinous crimes, can be a way for a perpetrator to seek some sort of psychological relief. Like, it's a burden they're carrying, a secret that's eating away at them. By confessing, they're releasing that burden, even if it means facing severe consequences.
So you're saying it's not necessarily about guilt or remorse, but more about this need to unburden themselves?
It could be. Or it could be a twisted form of control. Remember we talked about Green's need for control stemming from his chaotic childhood. Maybe confessing was a way for him to control the narrative, to shape how his story was told, even if it meant admitting to horrific acts. And then there's the hunger strike he went on while he was in jail.
Oh yeah, the hunger strike. That always seemed like a strange detail to me. What was he trying to prove with that?
Again, it could be about control. Prison is the ultimate environment of restriction, and a hunger strike is one of the few ways an inmate can exert some form of agency. It's a way of saying, I may be confined, but you can't control my will. And it's also interesting to note that Green's hunger strike was apparently a protest against the prison conditions.
Yeah. So maybe there was a sense of injustice there. Like he felt he was being treated unfairly, even though he was the one who committed these terrible crimes.
It's definitely possible. And that ties back to the idea of a distorted worldview. If Green truly believed that the world was against him, that he was constantly being wronged, then maybe he saw his actions as justified, even necessary. And speaking of a distorted worldview, we can't forget about that blood-stained mattress he gave to his father.
Okay, yeah, that mattress. That's one piece of the puzzle I haven't been able to wrap my head around. What was the deal with that?
Well, the mattress was allegedly stained with the blood of another possible victim, someone who hasn't been officially identified. Green supposedly gave it to his father for safekeeping, which seems, well, a bit counterintuitive to say the least.
You're telling me, I mean, if you're trying to hide evidence, why give it to your father? Unless, wait, are you thinking what I'm thinking?
I think so. It's possible that Green, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, still craved a sense of control over the situation. Maybe giving the mattress to his father was a way to hold on to a piece of his secret. A reminder that he still had power even as his world was crumbling around him.
Okay, that's chilling. It's like he wanted to keep a souvenir of his crimes, a reminder of his dark deeds. But I still don't understand why he confessed. I mean, if he was so desperate for control, wouldn't he have tried to deny everything, to take that secret to the grave with him?
That's a good point. And it's one that has baffled investigators and psychologists alike. Maybe the confession was a way to ensure his place in history, a morbid desire for notoriety. Or perhaps he believed that by confessing he could somehow manipulate the legal system, get a lighter sentence. Whatever the reason, his confession adds another layer of complexity to an already baffling case.
Well, confession or not, Green was eventually sentenced to death. And that brings us to the final chapter of his story, his execution, and the debate it sparked about capital punishment.
Yes, Green was executed by lethal injection in October of 1997. And even his execution was surrounded by unsettling details, like the fact that they had to use a single needle due to his history of drug use. It just adds this extra layer of, I don't know, a sense of the macabre, I guess.
It's like something out of a horror movie. The single needle detail. And then there's his last meal request. 5 scrambled eggs, 4 sausage patties, 8 slices of toast, 6 slices of bacon, and 4 pints of milk.
It's almost like he was trying to consume a lifetime's worth of food in one sitting.
I know. I can't help but wonder what goes through someone's mind when they're making that last meal request. Are they trying to find comfort in familiar foods? Or is it more about making a statement, leaving a final impression?
It's a question that has intrigued people for centuries, and there's no easy answer. But I think it speaks to the human need to find meaning, even in the face of our own mortality. Green also gave a final statement before his execution. He thanked God, his friends, and fellow inmates. He apologized to the victims' families and said that his death wouldn't solve anything.
It's strange to think about him apologizing in those final moments. Do you think it was genuine remorse? Or was it more about trying to salvage some shred of humanity in the eyes of others?
It's impossible to know for sure what was going on in his mind. But his final statement brings up a bigger question. What is the purpose of the death penalty? Is it about retribution, deterrence, or is it something else entirely?
It's a question that has been debated for centuries, and there are no easy answers. On one hand, you have the argument that certain crimes are so heinous, so unforgivable, that the only just punishment is death. It's about balancing the scales, restoring a sense of order in the face of unimaginable chaos.
Then you have the counter-argument, the belief that taking a life, even the life of someone who has committed terrible acts, is never the answer, that it doesn't bring back the victims, that it doesn't truly heal the wounds left behind. And there's the question of whether the death penalty actually deters crime. Some studies suggest it doesn't.
So we're left with this moral and ethical dilemma, a system designed to deliver justice, but that also raises profound questions about the nature of justice itself. And I think Green's case, with all its twists and turns, its contradictions and complexities, really highlights the messy reality of that dilemma. It's not just about black and white, guilty or innocent. It's about trying to understand the gray areas, the human factors that contribute to these tragedies.
You've hit the nail on the head. And that's why this case is so important to examine even all these years later. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, to challenge our own assumptions about crime and punishment, about good and evil.
So where do we go from here? What can we learn from Green's story? I mean, we've talked about trauma confession, the death penalty. It's a lot to unpack.
It is. But I think one of the most important takeaways is the need for greater understanding and awareness of childhood trauma. Green's horrific upbringing doesn't excuse his actions, but it does provide crucial context for understanding how someone could end up on such a death path.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we need to do more to protect children, to create environments where they feel safe and supported, to break the cycle of abuse before it even begins.
Exactly. And I think another important takeaway is the need for empathy. Empathy for the victims, for their families, but also empathy for those who have suffered trauma, who've been shaped by forces beyond their control. It's through empathy, through understanding, that we can begin to address the root causes of violence and work towards a more just and compassionate world.
I like that. Empathy, not just judgment. It's easy to condemn someone like Ricky Lee Green, to label him a monster and be done with it. But that doesn't really get us anywhere. It's by trying to understand the complexities, the human factors behind these horrific acts, that we can maybe start to make a difference.
Well said. And I think that brings us to the end of part 2. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's one more aspect of Green's case we need to explore: the role of the media. How did their coverage of his crimes shape public perception? Did it influence the outcome of his trial? And what about the victims? Were their stories given the same level of attention?
Those are some great questions. And they're questions we'll tackle head on in part 3. So stay tuned, folks. This deep dive is far from over. All right, we've talked about Green's horrific childhood, his puzzling confession, and the ethical dilemmas of the death penalty. Now, I'm really curious to explore the media's role in all of this. I mean, these crimes happened in the pre-internet days, but they still got a lot of attention, right?
Absolutely. Green's case was highly publicized, especially his trial. Newspapers and TV news were all over it, and the details of his crimes were, well, they didn't shy away from the gruesome stuff.
Yeah. That makes me wonder, did all that media attention, all those headlines and news reports, affect the outcome of his trial in any way? Like, Could it have swayed public opinion? Maybe even put pressure on the jury to deliver a certain verdict?
It's definitely a valid question. We know that the court of public opinion can be a powerful force, and intense media scrutiny can make it hard to ensure a fair trial. Jurors are human. They're exposed to the same news and narratives as everyone else.
Right. They can't just magically shut off the outside world.
Hmm.
And I imagine the media coverage probably wasn't always completely objective.
Exactly. There's always a risk of sensationalism, especially when you're dealing with a case as shocking as this one. And that sensationalism can sometimes create a narrative that's more about entertainment than about seeking truth and justice.
It's making me think about the flip side of that, too. We talked about how Green's defense focused on his abusive upbringing. Do you think the media's coverage of that aspect of his story might have even unintentionally generated some sympathy for him?
It's certainly possible. The media has the power to humanize or demonize. And the way a story is framed can have a huge impact on how people perceive the individuals involved. So yeah, the focus on Green's trauma might have led some people to question his culpability, even if it wasn't the intended outcome.
See, this is what I find so fascinating about exploring the media angle. It's not always clear-cut. There are all these unintended consequences and layers of influence. But there's one group we haven't talked about yet, whose voices often get lost in all the noise: the victims. How were their stories handled by the media?
That's a crucial point. Often the focus shifts to the perpetrator, the monster at the center of the story. But it's important to remember that behind every headline, there are real people who have suffered unimaginable loss, families whose lives have been shattered.
It's like the media sometimes forgets about the human cost of these crimes.
Yes. And that's something we should all be mindful of, not just journalists. We need to be careful about the language we use, the stories we choose to amplify, and the ways in which we engage with these complex and sensitive issues. It's not about censorship, it's about responsibility and respect.
Well said. I think this whole conversation about the media's role is a powerful reminder that we should always be critical consumers of information, questioning the narratives we're presented with, and seeking out multiple perspectives.
Absolutely. And it brings us back to the core purpose of these deep dives. It's not about finding easy answers or passing judgment. It's about exploring the complexities, wrestling with the uncomfortable truths, and engaging in thoughtful conversations that hopefully lead to greater understanding.
So as we wrap up our exploration of Ricky Lee Green's case, what are some of the key takeaways you hope our listener walks away with?
Well, I think it all comes back to the importance of empathy, like we discussed earlier. Empathy for the victims, empathy for those who have suffered trauma, and yes, even empathy for the perpetrators, as challenging as that may be. It's through understanding rather than judgment that we can truly begin to heal and move forward.
Powerful words. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the darkest corners of Green's childhood to the broader societal questions about justice, punishment, and the role of the media.
I hope this exploration has given you, our listener, some new insights and perspectives to consider. Remember, this conversation doesn't have to end here. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep striving to make sense of the world around you.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, stay curious and keep diving deep.